All right, let's open with prayer. Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you for bringing us all here together, for giving us this opportunity, this time to join as your church, a time for worship and praise, a time for fellowship and connection, and a time to just learn and immerse ourselves in your word. And so, Lord, I just ask that you just prepare our hearts and our minds to receive your word, and that you just open up our ears, our physical ears, our spiritual ears, to receive whatever message it is that you have for us this morning. And I just lift up also those who are traveling today, coming back from spring break, and all who couldn't be with us. And we just pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right, so for the last couple of weeks, Jim said last week, it's kind of fallen into this informal sermon series that he's dubbed The Essentials. And when I was preparing my message for this morning, the topic of forgiveness came up. And so it fits really nicely into this kind of informal series we've been doing. And when we think about essentials, one of the most essential things, I believe, is the Lord's Prayer. And I'm going to start with the Lord's Prayer, okay? And then we're going to zoom in and dive really deep. I promise not to leave you there, let you drown in information, but we're going to come back out of it and hopefully have something really cool. So for those of you who have the Lord's Prayer memorized, I tend to do it the King James Version, but it's going to be up on the screen. So I invite you to recite it with me, okay? All right, there we go. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. All right. So the line that I want to zoom in on is forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And it's a pivotal point to focus on, and especially kind of as we prepare for the Easter season. And really, I think a lot of times we can immerse ourselves in this gratitude. Lord, thank you for forgiving me, right? Thank you for forgiving me of my debts. But do we express as much gratitude for the second part? Like, we tend to focus on the first part, right? Forgive me my debts. The second part, as we forgive our debtors. And I bring that up because the very next verse, after Jesus just recited the Lord's Prayer, it says, "For if you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses." We tend to skip over that part, but yet there's a really serious caution in that, right? There's a really serious warning that we need to take forgiving just as seriously as we take receiving his forgiveness for us. And that's what I want to dive into. And what's really interesting about that particular passage, Jesus pretty much repeats it later in Matthew 18 at the end of the parable of the unmerciful servant. And really, if you look at that parable, it's like an elaboration, a deep dive into that idea of forgiveness, and really thinking on both sides, receiving and giving, right, the forgiveness. And the parable of the unmerciful servant, it is triggered by a question from Peter, okay? So Peter asks him, "Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times?" Now, there's a couple reasons why Peter offers number 7. So at the time, the Babylonian era Talmud, so what the Talmud is a collection of rabbinic teachings to help observant Jews know how to actually live out the law, right? So the law may have a line in there about a particular thing to do or not do, but it doesn't necessarily clearly explain, well, what does that look like? Like in practical terms, what does that exactly mean? So rabbis would teach on it, and their teachings became the Talmud. So they would look to the Talmud to help them understand, how do I live this out? What does this actually look like? So in the law, it says we're supposed to forgive, but it didn't say how many times. So they went to the rabbis. Rabbis, how many times do we need to forgive? And in the Talmud, it said 3. 3 times, okay? So when Peter comes up to Jesus and says, now what do you say? How many times should I forgive, right? He knows that the Pharisees, the rabbis, teach 3. So he's like, I'm going to more than double it. Like, I'm going to look real good because the rabbis teach 3. I'm going to offer 7. But the other reason is that 7 in Hebrew means completion, perfection, wholeness. So not only is he more than doubling it, but he's like, it's also the perfect number, right? It has to be, right? If I forgive 7 times, that means completion. I'm done. I've completely forgiven. And Jesus says, nope. I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 77 times. And in some translations, it says 7 times 70. So whether it's 7 times 70 or 7 plus 70, he's taking the 7 that Peter's offering, right? But then there's that 70. And in Hebrew, 70 represented a righteous life. So yes, 7, right? Completion, perfection, but for the entirety of your life. If you want a righteous life, you forgive and you keep on forgiving. It's not 7 times. It's 7 times 70, or it's 7 plus 70. It's perfection plus a righteous life. So that's where he starts, right? Is that answer. And the very next word is therefore, right? So based off of that, therefore, you can compare the kingdom of heaven, right, to a king. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the parable of the unmerciful servant, it's the story of a king, right? And he calls all of his accounts, everybody that owes him something, right? He calls them in. And there's this one servant who owes him a lot of money. And he says, well, it's time to pay up, right? It's time to make good on the debt that you owe me. And the servant just throws himself down on the ground. Please have mercy on me. Give me more time. I don't have it yet, right? And the king shows him mercy. Not only does it's not about giving him more time like he asked, he wipes it out, right? He says, okay, I'm going to make your account 0. You don't owe me anything. Well, then that servant goes out, sees a buddy of his that owes him a little bit of money, and all of a sudden he's like, hey, you still owe me that. You haven't paid up. And so his buddy's like, well, I don't have it on me. If you can just show me mercy, if you could just give me some more time. And instead of showing him the same mercy that he just received, he says, nope, take him to debtor's prison until he can pay it off. Well, the king hears about this, and he gets mad. The verse says, it actually says, in anger. He calls that unmerciful servant forward, reinstates his debt, and puts him in debtor's prison. Okay? And what's interesting is that at the end of that, that's where it says, and if you do not forgive your brother from your heart, the Father's going to do the same thing. It's the same warning he already gave. He's now repeating it, but giving you an illustration. Like this is an example, and if you're just like that unmerciful servant, the Father's going to do the same thing. So this is something for us to take seriously. Now, when I thought on it, why is the king so angry? It says in anger, right? And I think the obvious thing is hypocrisy, right? It's like, okay, you went and begged for mercy, but yet when somebody else begs for mercy, you're not showing it. Then there's just that lack of gratitude, right? Like you had this big debt paid off, and then here's your buddy who owes you like $20. It's like, where's the gratitude? And then you're just being ungodly, right? The king represents God in this story. Did I step on something? God's making a point here. But being ungodly because the king represents God, right? And it's like instead of being like the king, he goes out and does the opposite. But as I sat in this, the Lord was like, there's so much more to it. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to do, like I said, a deep dive. So we're going to put a pin in here. We're going to come back to the parable later. And so what I want to ask then is, before Jesus came, how were sins forgiven? I'm hearing a lot of animal sacrifices, right? Yeah. What if I were to say, not really? No. okay? And let me explain, because it's like, well, hold up. The whole Old Testament, the temple, it was pretty bloody. There was a lot of animal sacrifice. So what was that all about, right? And didn't John the Baptist, when he saw Jesus, say, look, it's the Passover lamb. He's come to take away the sins of the world, right? Yes, Jesus was the Passover lamb. And yes, he came to take away the sins of the world. But that has nothing to do with you. That doesn't cover us. Okay? You are forgiven, but not with the Passover lamb. Let me explain. Go back to the story of Passover, right? It's the Exodus story. The Israelites are in slavery in Egypt, okay? Through the burning bush, God calls Moses and tells him, you need to go to the Pharaoh, right? I want my people free. So Moses comes in, let my people go. Pharaoh, no. God, plague, right? We do this 10 times. The 10th one was the curse of the death of the firstborn son. And it was going to apply to everybody, including cattle, including the animals. And what God did was for his people, he said, if you take a lamb and you sacrifice it and you take its blood and you put it over the doorpost, then the angel of death will pass over, right? And the lives of the firstborn sons in your home will be spared. Now, here's the thing. It only applied to the firstborn, okay? But also, it didn't break the curse. It put it off. It caused it to pass over. Because later, in Exodus 34, God instates an annual feast, a Passover feast, to remember what he did for them. But he also instated an annual sacrifice, okay? And it says at the end there, all the firstborn of your sons you shall redeem, and none shall appear before me empty-handed. So every year, the firstborn son had to show up with a lamb, and it had to be sacrificed to have that death curse pass over them for another year. Year after year, no firstborn son could show up empty-handed. They had to have some kind of sacrifice to keep that death curse passing over. Okay? So, when we then look at whether or not Jesus was the final Passover lamb, yes, he was. He was the final, the ultimate Passover lamb, okay? And did he take away the sins of the world? Well, he took away the sins of the firstborn. He redeemed the firstborn. But something that's important to remember is that everything that Moses did foreshadowed what Jesus came to do. So what Moses did in the natural, Jesus came and did in the supernatural, right? What Moses did in the physical, Jesus came to do in the spiritual. So Moses led the people out of physical slavery. Jesus led us out of spiritual slavery, okay? So these sacrifices was a literal redemption of the firstborn, causing death to pass over year after year. So then when Jesus came and offered himself as the Passover lamb, well, then what he did was he caused death to pass over for all the spiritual firstborn. Okay? So then the question is, well, who is this? Who's the spiritual firstborn then, right? We get some insight in Hebrews 12. I'm going to warn you right now, we got lots of verses. You can follow along if you like. I'm going to read this one out of the NIV. Okay. So the writer of Hebrews, what they're describing is when we get to heaven, okay? So it says, you've come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. So he's talking about heaven, right? What are we going to see when we get to heaven? Well, you've come to thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly, so we get to see that. We also get to see the church of the firstborn, whose names are written in heaven. And you've come to God, the judge of all. We get to see God. But we also get to see the spirits of the righteous made perfect. Two separate groups. The firstborn, whose names are written in heaven, and then the saints, the spirits of the righteous, who've been made perfect. Okay? The firstborn, whose names are written in heaven, Those are all the firstborn saints. They're the ones who lived before Jesus. Okay? Because with Jewish people in the fall, they have Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. What they have to do is year after year, to this day, year after year, they have to beg God to put their names into the book of life for another year. Okay? We don't have to beg, and then we don't have to have our name renewed. Our name's written in there permanently in blood, right? But they did. So that firstborn, it's talking about the Jewish saints, the firstborn saints who lived before Jesus, okay? Who kept having, right, death pass over. The spirits of the righteous being made perfect is us. We are forgiven, just not by Jesus being the Passover lamb. And I'll get to that. But really understanding what Jesus did as the Passover lamb and what this really means with the firstborn saints. Well, one of the key firstborn saints was Abraham. Okay? And if you're following along, we're going to go to Romans 4. Now here's what's interesting, is a lot of people think that before Jesus in the Old Testament, that obeying the law is what saved people. No. And if you want to read the whole book of Romans, I mean, you got to read it all together to fully understand his argument. But that's what Paul's whole first part of Romans is about, is no, the law never saved anybody. But that's also where the Jewish people went wrong, is they started treating the law as if it was a check mark, and if we do it, we get to be righteous, right? And that's not what Paul's saying. No, it was always supposed to be in faith. You were supposed to obey the law in faith, right? Well, Abraham, he lived before the law. He lived before Moses. And that's why I think he uses Abraham to show them, look, here's Abraham, the father of our faith, pre-law, right? And he says, now, for if Abraham was justified by works, justification, justified, okay? In Sunday school, I was taught that justification means just as if I never sinned, right? So if Abraham was made just as if he had never sinned, right? By works, well, he would have something to boast about. But that's not how he was saved. The next verse says, what does Scripture actually say? Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him as righteousness. In other translations, it says it was credited to him as righteousness, okay? So he wasn't righteous because he followed a law. He wasn't righteous at all, righteous being right with God. Instead, his faith. He believed in God. His faith in God was credited to him, was accounted to him. So what that means is all this sin debt, right? All this sin debt that, kept getting passed over and passed over and passed over. Well, someone's got to pay for it, right? At some point, because the wages of sin is what? Death. Okay? So if death keeps passing over, who's going to pay up? Okay? And that's what it was, those who had faith, the firstborn saints, it kept getting passed over and passed over and passed over because their faith was put on their account. It was extended like a line of credit. They were given a line of credit. Somebody had to pay that line of credit off, right? Okay. I want to back up to Romans 3:25 and explain what that looked like, because this is just, I think, cool. Okay, so the last part of Romans 3:25. Okay, so it says he came to demonstrate his righteousness because in his forbearance. Okay, now I know what that word means because I have student loans. And when I went back to school I don't remember how many times, but they put my loan into forbearance, right? So that while I was in school, I didn't have to make payments on it. But once I was out of school, payments resumed, okay? That's what God was doing. He took their sin debt and he put it into forbearance, okay? And it says right there, because in his forbearance, God did what? Passed over sins that were previously committed. He's explaining the Passover lamb right here. All the firstborn saints had their sin debt put into forbearance, right? So death kept passing over. Well, somebody's got to pay it. That's what Jesus did as the final and ultimate Passover lamb. So when John the Baptist said, there's the Passover lamb, come to take away the sins of the world, yes, because all that sin debt, all those accounts had to be paid off. Jesus did take away all the sin of the world, right, that had been accumulated up to that point. The very next verse, it says, why did he do that? To demonstrate at the present time his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier. He had to be just. That debt had to be paid, right? Sin had to be resolved. We couldn't just ignore it. We couldn't just keep kicking the can down the road. Like at some point, it had to be reconciled. So God had to be just. And by sending down Jesus, he also got to be the justifier. Remember, justified, just as if I never sinned. So he got to be just, and he also got to be the one who justified and made them all just as if they never sinned. So he was the Passover lamb, but it has nothing to do with us. It had to do with paying off all those accounts that had accumulated up to that moment. Okay? Still based on faith, but he was paying off what was due, what was accumulated over time. So then the question is, what about us then? How are we saved? Because we are. How is our sins forgiven? It's just not as the Passover lamb. So one of the things I want you to walk away with is Jesus wasn't the final sacrifice. He was all of them. He wasn't just the Passover lamb. There were 3 sin-related sacrifices in Levitical law. So if he's just and justifier, he has to cover all of them. Okay? So as Passover lamb, but then now we got to look at the future, right? What about us? So the first of the offerings, the sin offerings, was called a burnt offering. And that one is where you take the whole animal, the whole person, right? And it is sacrificed. And it says that the smoke, like as the sacrifice was burned, the smoke would ascend and it would symbolize reconciliation with God. So the Passover lamb, that sacrifice was a burnt offering. So as the Passover lamb, he was the burnt offering for them, but he was also a burnt offering for us because in Ephesians 5:2, Paul says that he was a fragrant offering and a sacrifice. So the burnt offering is reconciliation. He reconciled us with God. So he reconciled all the firstborn saints. Well, reconcile. We're talking accounting terms, right? It's like he came and he reconciled all their accounts as the Passover lamb. But he's also prepaid our accounts. We've been reconciled too. It's just prepaid. Okay? So reconcile before God, that's the burnt offering. Then there's the sin offering. And the sin offering is burnt outside, and the blood is taken into the sanctuary and sprinkled to cleanse it. Okay? Well, we're now the sanctuary. We're now the temple. And think about the verses that talk about our heart being sprinkled clean with his blood, right? But it's even more than that. If you turn to Hebrews 13, Tracy's doing a great job keeping up with me. I have her all over the place. All right, so starting in verse 10, we have an altar from which those who serve the tabernacle have no right to eat. So what the writer of Hebrews is now comparing is the old temple and the old altar, right? After the sacrifice, the priests were allowed to eat the meat, okay? But now the altar is inside of us. We're the temple, right? And so it's a different temple. It's a different system. And it says that's why the priests, they have no right to us. They have no right to what we sacrifice because now it's directly between us and God. Verse 11, for the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest for sin are burned outside the camp. Verse 12, therefore, Jesus also that he might sanctify the people with his blood, suffered outside the gate. So he was a burnt offering. He was a sin offering. He has reconciled us with God, and he has cleansed us of our sin. Cleansed us inside so that we could be a temple to house his spirit. Okay? So those are the first two. The third one was called a guilt offering. And the guilt offering is restitution. It's the reparation against whoever has been sinned against. It's payment to make them whole, to make amends, okay? And back in Romans 3, one of the phrases Paul used was propitiation, right? He was a propitiation for our sins. Well, John, the Apostle John now, he used the same phrase in his first letter, 1 John 2. And he himself is the propitiation for our sins, and not for ours only, but also for the whole world. So this is now the Apostle John. Because John the Baptist, he died before Jesus did. He's one of the firstborn saints who had his account paid off, right? But this is now the Apostle John, and he's talking to us after the crucifixion. And propitiation means appeasement. Go back to the just and justifier, restitution, repayment, okay? So before John the Baptist said, take away the sins of the world, that was referring to the firstborn saints. But what the Apostle John is talking about now to us is it's the whole world. And now it's also future, prepayment, prepaying for us, that restitution. So that's why I said he's not just the sacrifice. He's all the sacrifices. He was the Passover lamb paying off the debt of the firstborn. He's the burnt offering reconciling us to God. He's the sin offering cleansing us. He's the guilt offering serving as our restitution, our repayment on our behalf. I don't know about you, but that kind of blew my mind when I sat there and really dug into it. Hebrews 10:14 captures this. It says, for by one offering, he has perfected forever those who are being sanctified. So go back to the assembly of the firstborn, but then who else gets to be in heaven? The spirits of the righteous who were made perfect. Us. By one offering, he covered it all. Forever. Right? Anybody just hear me say forever like that, and all of a sudden, like you're thinking of a movie quote? Forever, right? I heard it. So, forever. But think about that. The effects of the cross, it rippled out in all directions. Okay? It reconciled us to God. It put hell on notice. It went back and paid off all the accumulated debt of the firstborn saints and went forward and prepaid all of ours. The effects of the cross rippled in all directions, and it's still rippling. Okay? So, let's take that back now to the unmerciful servant. Jesus is telling this story before his death, okay? And so the audience is still part of the firstborn saint group, right? So that's why he's telling it the way he's telling it, because they are still accumulating debt, right? It's not paid off till Jesus dies. So when he's telling the story, he's talking about that accumulation, okay? And then he says that it needs to be paid off, right? So all their debt needs to be paid off, just like the servant in the story, or servants in the story. But what they don't know that he knows is the king. He doesn't have an Excel spreadsheet that he just like goes in and just like punches in a zero. It's a real debt that has to be paid. And that king, in order to zero out their accounts, had to go and become the payment. In order for that unmerciful servant's account to be zeroed out, the king became the payment. We see now why he's so angry. The king became the payment. Let's look at Colossians 2. (13 and 14). Tracy, can we switch that one to NIV too? Is that possible? New King James sometimes. It's not exact. I'm going to read it out of the New King or the NIV. But when you were dead in your sins and in the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive with Christ. He forgave us all our sins, having canceled out the charge of our legal indebtedness, which stood against us and condemned us. He has taken it away, nailing it to a cross. Still talking about those accounts, right? He took it away by nailing it to a cross, by becoming the payment. But he didn't just pay off the unmerciful servant's debt. He paid off everybody's debt. He paid off all of it. So when he comes up to his buddy and says, hey, you still owe me, actually, the king has zeroed out everybody's account. Right? Maybe news hadn't arrived yet, but Jesus paid off all of our accounts, past, present, and future. And what's interesting about that is we focus a lot on Jesus paying off the debt we owed to God. But again, what's odd about this as well as the Lord's Prayer, the first part, forgive us our debts, right? The king forgave his debt. But then the second part switches all of a sudden now to our interactions with each other, right? You've forgiven my debt, but then I'm supposed to go and forgive others' debt, right? The unmerciful servant, the king zeroed out his account, but then he didn't zero out his buddy's debt, his buddy's account, okay? And when we look at, okay, why is the king so angry? It's like, well, not only, yes, hypocrisy and ingratitude and ungodliness, but the king offered himself to the unmerciful servant as payment for his buddy's debt. And what did he say? No thanks. I want it from him. When we refuse to forgive, we are holding on to a debt that Jesus has paid. But instead of taking that payment, we're saying, oh no, they still got to pay. Thanks, but no thanks, Jesus. They need to pay, right? Because think about it. If I sin against you, right, I just created a debt, okay? And it's a real debt. I'm not sugarcoating that. People owe you, right? People hurt us, pain, anger. We lose things. We lose trust. We lose faith. We lose hope sometimes. Like, this is a real debt. But the reality is we don't forgive innocent people. We forgive guilty people. So acknowledge it. Yes, they hurt you. They owe you. Okay? But they can't pay you back. They can't make you whole. They can't go back in time and not do what they did. They can't restore you for the pain, the hurt, the anger, the fear, everything you've lost. They can't make you whole. So you have options then. Okay, you owe me, right? There's a real debt, but you can't pay it. Well, I can hold on to it, like the unmerciful servant did, right? I can hold on to it, but by doing that, I'm refusing Jesus. I'm declining Jesus. I'm turning him down as payment. He is offering himself as payment. I've already paid this, and we're saying, I'll pass. No wonder the king is angry, right? It makes me think of Moses, right? We were talking about Moses. He wasn't allowed to go into the promised land. You know why? He hit a rock a second time. That's it. He hit a rock a second time. And after all of that he went through, couldn't go into the promised land. But it's because hitting the rock represented crucifying Jesus, and God told him to do it once. So by doing it twice, he was crucifying Jesus a second time. So by refusing to forgive when Jesus is there, take me, I'm payment, and we're saying, no thanks. We're hitting the rock a second time. Right? No, Jesus, that wasn't enough. I need them too. Anybody else want to go and stand in front of Jesus and say you weren't enough? Because he wasn't just the sacrifice, he was all of them for all of us. So that's the first option, is to be unforgiving. But the second option is one I encounter a lot, which is where a person decides to forgive, right? They make up their mind to. They may even say it, right? Like, I forgive, I choose to forgive, but yet they don't release. There's no zeroing out of the account. So it's like I'm saying it, but I'm not doing it, right? Because at the end of the unmerciful servant, it says you have to forgive with your heart. The decision's made up here. The releasing's done here. And sometimes the farthest distance for something to travel is the 18 inches from your mind to your heart. And it made me think of a Seinfeld episode, which is funny because I wasn't the biggest fan of Seinfeld, but this particular episode made me laugh because in the scene, Jerry traveled to do a show, and he's at the car rental place. And the girl at the counter says, sorry, I don't have any cars. And he's like, but I have a reservation. And she goes, yes, I see that. It's on the computer. So where's the car? And she goes, I don't have any cars. And he's like, okay, so you have the reservation. Well, the most important part of the reservation is to reserve the car, right? Well, how many of us on paper in the computer will say, yeah, we've forgiven that, but we haven't actually released. The important part is the releasing part, okay? And for those of you who've come and done inner healing with me, it's very rare I use the word forgive. Instead, I walk you through releasing. Because we don't talk about forgiving. We do the forgiving. We release it to Jesus. Okay? So that's the second option, is I can say it, I can decide it, but yet I haven't actually released. Or maybe when Jesus isn't looking, I go pick it back up again. But he's always looking. So he knows. So King's still angry, right? Because not only are you rejecting him as payment, you're now lying. Saying you've forgiven, but not forgiving. Third option, acknowledge the debt, release it to Jesus, okay? But don't stop there, because there are some of us, if I were to ask you, you'd say, no, I've actually released. I've let go of stuff. I'm not walking around holding grudges. I've done a good job. I've actually released. But you haven't received the payment. You haven't let Jesus make you whole. That's the third step. Okay? Acknowledge it, release it, and embrace him as payment. Because while they can't make you whole, because they can't go back in time, remember the effects of the cross ripple out in all directions. And if you'll let him, he will. If you were to picture a debt that somebody owes you and then picture Jesus there and say, this is what they owe me, he knows, he was there, he saw. And then release it to him and then embrace him as payment and say, Jesus, make me whole. Reach back into my mind, reach back into my memories, reach back into my heart and fill in those gaps, those spaces, those voids. make me whole. He will do it. And I will tell you, traumatic memories that just would trigger me and would torment me, they're nothing now. Because when Jesus makes you whole, you are free. It's not like I forgot it happened, but all of a sudden, he's made it right. So we are grateful, right, that Jesus has paid off our debt, but we need to be just as grateful that he's paid off other people's debt. But because by doing so, I get to receive the payment. I get to receive more of him. I get to be made whole. So when we pray that, forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors, that first part, Jesus, come be my burnt offering, reconcile me to God. Come be my sin offering, cleanse me of my sin. Oh, Lord, please be my guilt offering. Be my restitution for all the people I've wronged, all the people I've hurt, all the debt I can't repay. And Lord, I just pray that they receive you and that they receive it, because I can't go back and undo it. I can't make things right. I can't restore them, but you can. So thank you, Jesus. Thank you for paying off my debt, not just with you, but with everybody I've wronged. And Lord, may they receive you, and may they be made whole on my behalf. That's what forgiveness is. It's not just thanking God for paying off my sin debt so that I can get my get out of hell free card. It is so much more. It's about restoration. Forgiving my debtors so that I can be restored. And thanking Jesus for forgiving mine and praying that those I owe can be restored. So, how I would like to close the service is I'm going to lead you through the Lord's Prayer again, but we're going to personalize it. Okay? So, if you wouldn't mind standing. I want you to close your eyes. I just picture Jesus here with you. Okay? And I want you to repeat after me. My Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give me this day my daily bread, and forgive me my debts. Be my burnt offering. Reconcile me to you. Be my sin offering. Wash me clean of my sin. Be my guilt offering. Make those I have wronged whole, as I forgive my debtors. And I receive you as their guilt offering, as their restitution. I ask that you make me whole and lead me not into temptation, but deliver me from evil. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. If our prayer team can come up to the front. If that, thank you. If that was your first time praying that prayer and meaning it, please come up. Talk to one of our prayer team members. We want to celebrate. We want to talk about next steps. But we're also here to pray for anything else. So anybody who wants to be prayed for, just receive prayer, make your way up to the front. And for those of you who leave, if you could do so quietly. But let me just bless you. May the Lord bless you and keep you safe. And may your life be a witness of his love and grace. Have a blessed week. Thank you.